Okay, welcome back. This is take two on the video that I mentioned in the last one that I meant to make, and the sound didn't work. Hopefully, the sound works this time. It should. And so, just going to have sort of an open-ended discussion about the game rules I want to work on. I've been working on them. Started them actually during the original initial lockdowns back in March. And I've been kind of working in fits and starts off and on. Admittedly, haven't touched it in a little while. But So the main premise of the game, I want to do a large skirmish or large skirmish type game to kind of represent Ottoman and Habsburg borderland warfare in the 16th century, potentially the 17th century, but I think just for now, going to focus on the 16th century because if I do too much, I'd have to create like really big army lists. So that's a bit too ambitious, I think, for now. So I'm going to focus on like the uh, mid late 16th century, I think, or just the 16th century in general. Um, and Unlike some other war games, this trend towards skirmish gaming, this isn't designed as a skirmish game to streamline or whatever. It's a skirmish game because that fits the actual nature of the historical battles that occurred in this region. So you're talking about probably, I would say at minimum, maybe 10 figures per side. And, max, this rough estimate, maybe 50 or 60, just to represent, so you can have maybe some isolated detachments or bands of warriors on the smaller scale, and then you have larger sort of garrisons on the higher end, sort of similar to what I've done in those Pikeman's Lament battle reports. So that's the foundation of the game, and I was motivated to do this, to try to start working on this because um, Pike and Shot does have army lists for Imperialists and it has armies for Ottomans, but um, as I said in my review of that set of rules, which I generally like, um, if it's a good toolbox, but it's really got limitations if you want to really zoom in on a period and really play it. If you just want to get a game going and kind of move models, that's fine, and that's what it's good for. Or you're trying to run like a convention game and you need sort of a baseline set of rules, like, so if people come up and you say, oh, it's black powder or pike and shot, a lot of war gamers will be like, okay, I know what's going on here, and then you add in your scenario rules. But for this, I wanted something different and a little more specialized for the period, but at the same time not getting too into the weeds, because I think that's its own sort of problem. So the system would be generally, so activation, it would be similar to Pikeman's Lament, which I should mention quickly because I really like Pikeman's Lament, and it's a great generic system. Or if you're doing like 30 Years' War, English Civil War, where you've got similar European armies, Western European armies fighting, um, I think that it works really well. But if you want something to represent like the East or the Ottoman frontier, it's not as good. It'll work. I mean, I've done it, and it works fine. But I just wanted to make something a little more unique to represent the region and the period. So that's why I wouldn't just make it a straight up modification of Pikeman's Lament. So in my rule system, so potentially the activation sequence would be based on a leadership test. So like just like Pikeman's Lament or Warlord Black Powder / Pike and Shot. I like that system. I think that's pretty good. But then you'd also have an initiative um, rule to as well, initiative based activation. if you're in range of the enemy, a certain range, 6 inches. I think that's pretty good. Where the unit doesn't really need orders necessarily, but instead of having a single command figure, it would just activate based on whatever that particular unit's leadership or morale value would be. And then you would get one activation, and it would be one unit and then the other unit. So it wouldn't be a full I go you go type game where every one side moves all of their stuff, the other side moves all their stuff. I don't really like that. I think that doesn't really work well overall, and especially in a skirmish system where I'm trying to represent like a kind of a quick moving but brutal sort of combat. So that's what I'm kind of thinking of with that. Um, and I like that system. And then if you fail a roll, um, that unit doesn't activate, your activation ends. I think that's pretty good. Or depending, since it's smaller scale, I might just have it um, be, it, if you fail one activation, it's just that unit doesn't activate. I think that might work a little bit better. A lot of this is still me brainstorming out loud, so I apologize. And then so activation movement, I'm going to keep that pretty simple. No individual movement values. It's just going to be divided based on the unit type. So infantry is going to move 6. Going to have heavy cavalry probably move 8 or 9, I think. Um, and then light cavalry move a move probably 12, I think. Um, anyway, but that's the spirit. Just keep things simple. No need for individual values based on movement, because I think one of the dangers with having like an army-less system, especially for a historical game, sometimes if it gets, excuse me, if it gets too in depth, that kind of slows gameplay down with too many statistics. So it's a balancing act, I guess. Um, and then I think I would also probably have maybe like a skirmisher rule for infantry. So this is sort of related to movement. The way it's planned, there would be basically two different types of infantry. So you would have ranked formation infantry that they need to fight in some sort of line of battle. So, like for example, a unit of Janissaries, they're mostly accustomed to fighting in a musket line, doing volley fire, um, and yes, they can skirmish, but for gameplay purposes, I would just have them. They have to stay in that formation. That's sort of their drawback. Um, but then if you have, for example, like a unit of um, I just for shorthand call them like Habsburg Skirmishers. They could potentially fire in both formations, but they're not as effective in the volley fire, or the skirmishing fire is less accurate. So something like that, and that's related to movement. Um, and then the movement, and then cavalry would be the same thing. So you would have some units that could move in like that have to move like in a formation if they're heavier, like shock cavalry, and then light cavalry can move in a broken sort of formation they'd like to. Like if you have some Ottoman Spahi that are provincial Spahi that are archers, horse-mounted archers, they could do either conceivably. But then if you have a unit of German, like heavy cuirassier or something, or gendarme, some other form of heavy cavalry, they have to move in a sort of a formation to be effective. Um, and part of that too is having two different sort of um, styles of formation, is just so the if so basing really isn't an issue, so you can have stuff that's based on um, that's based communally or individually, and it doesn't it's not going to break the game either way, or the basing isn't sort of the central feature of the game. Like with the formation infantry, as long as they can be approximated into some kind of formation and move in that way, then that's totally legit. Um, and then skirmish infantry with sort of communally based figures, you can still sort of replicate that. They don't necessarily have to move in a fluid or in a block. Um, you can have the bases split up. So like if you have like I do, like if you have stuff based on Warlord 40 mil infantry bases, you can kind of spread them out and just to represent that they're in a skirmish formation, then they can move that way. Um, and then so shooting would be pretty straightforward. I would only really have three classes of missile weapons. Um, so muskets, obviously, um, pistols, bow and arrow, because it was still a pretty predominant weapon in the 16th century, especially in the East. And potentially artillery. I'm not sure about that because that might be a little too much for the kind of flavor of game I'm going for. And in terms of my research, I don't really read much about the use of uh, artillery guns in this sort of level of warfare. A lot of these skirmishes got uh, pretty bad or pretty significant, but um, I don't see much artillery, so I don't think I'd add that in there. But we'll see as I kind of work through it, or if you guys have sort of suggestions in the comments, I'd be happy to hear it. People that have been gaming longer than me, if you want to throw anything in there. Um, and then shooting would be each unit would get a shooting amount, so you'd roll a certain number of dice based on that unit statistic, and this is where some of the formation stuff would come in. So, like Janissaries in ranked fire would get um, a like 4 shooting dice, but then you have skirmishers in um, a loose order or open order. Maybe they only get 2 or 3 shooting dice. Um, and they um, they can't fire as many shots. But the advantage would be those skirmishers can move more quickly around the battlefield because they're not going to get obstructed in formation by terrain features and that sort of thing. So that's sort of the trade-off there. Now, one thing related to this that as an idea I had, not quite sure if it would get too complicated. So in the Beneath the Lily Banners rules from Warfare Miniatures and League of Augsburg. I haven't played these, but part of the mechanics for the newer edition of that is different like troop qualities get different dice to roll to hit. And I think that's an interesting idea, but again, I'm not sure if that would complicate things too much or needlessly. Um, so, for example, everything would generally hit on like a 5 for shooting, but you could get you could have a unit of let's just say like elite Spanish troops, Spanish garrison troops for the Habsburgs, and because they're highly trained and a good marksmen or whatever, or well disciplined, they're going to roll a D8 instead of a D6 to hit, just to show that they're a little bit better, and then you could have less, frontier mercenaries for the Habsburgs, and they're rolling D6s. Um, so that's a possibility, and that would kind of change up the shooting system. So you would have an action roll. So if you went to roll um, to hit, you just roll your one action die, and then if you succeed in that action, you would then roll to see how many casualties you did, and then that would uh, wound on probably threes or fours, depending on the weapon, with D6s. So again, don't know if that would be too complicated, and I'm still trying to like brainstorm this out. Um, And then, so that's one possibility. I do kind of like that, and because it would definitely make the units different. But at the same time, for a skirmish game, I don't know if that would be appealing to have to lug around, or have, a bunch of several different sets of dice. That's why, to minimize that, it would just be, let's say you're doing a lower scale skirmish game, so 3 units per side. You have two that use d6s to roll for their action, and then you have an elite unit, and it takes one d8 or something, something like that. But again, not sure. That might be something going forward, if I continue to work on this, which I probably will, um, to work out in the play testing. And then, assault close combats would work pretty similar to the shooting, depending on which system I would go with, either the action dice or just the straight up. You roll the number of shooting or, combat dice indicated on the profile. That's how many casualties you get, which is admittedly pretty much the system in Warlord, like Black Powder and Pike and Shot. But I think, as I discuss it more, I think the action dice is a little more appealing, than just having, straight d6s. And then that's how close combat would work. You'd have morale, so depending on how many casualties you took in that phase, you would, have to take a morale test at a penalty of however many casualties you lost. So, nothing crazy there. Now, a few things that I would have to sort of change up, just generic musket and horse rules, to better reflect the period. I would have a feature where you could have, most troops, because this was historically the case, you could have pretty much any troop be mounted, if you paid like a certain points cost or something, or there was like an upgrade in the army list, because even, on most sides, even if the fighters weren't necessarily like cavalrymen, they would just ride to get around. So pretty much everybody would be a dragoon. And then I would have a feature where, you those if you take a unit that's mounted, if you upgrade them to be mounted, they can also dismount in the game. Um, and that leads me sort of into the next point of taking captives, because this was a big part of the conflict on both sides. So you would have a potential to capture the horses, and that would gain victory points in scenarios. And then you could also have the potential to capture a defeated unit in a combat. So uh, if and so how I've kind of thought about that rule is, if you get attacked in close combat and you take a certain number of casualties, you can attempt a capture. So you can attempt to capture the opposing side. So it would be probably a leadership roll off. So if the unit succeeds its leadership roll off without penalty, um, it would escape. If the loser succeeds, it escapes and they don't get captured. But if it fails the roll off, it would get captured. So they would be taken captive, and they would be out of the game. But um, at the same time, that unit would be the capturing unit would then be sort of tied up potentially for a turn or so, because they're trying to wrangle the captives. Again, haven't thought all these mechanics out, but these are just trying to lay out some of the concepts. And like I said, that would be worth victory points depending on the scenario. Um, and then, in addition to being taken captives in close combat, I would also have a feature where if a unit took casualties from shooting, you can sort of attempt a nearby unit can attempt to take the target unit captive. So, just to do an example, you've got a unit of, let's say, Spanish Habsburg musketeers. They fire on your unit of Ottoman. The proper term was Martolos, but basically garrison mercenaries. So they fire on your Ottoman garrison mercenaries. They take, 3 casualties out of 10. They have to take a leadership check. But let's say you have a unit of Hungarian Habsburg horse within charge distance of those units. So you can attempt a charge roll and have your cavalry swoop in and try and like take them captive, and then you do your leadership roll off. Now the target unit would be able, if they succeed in the leadership roll off, they could, yes, they could break off and escape, but then they could also attempt. They would also stick the unit that's attempting to capture them into close combat. Um, so that's part of that. That would be another aspect, and that would all be for victory points. And most of the scenarios would pretty much be a straight up victory point type situation. And the reason why would be, this was mostly war for personal gain. In a lot of cases, I mean, it was in many cases glorified banditry. Depending on the circumstances. Um, and So, how many captives can you take? And then I would probably also have some sort of mechanic where your force, and that would probably be tied into the point system or something like it. Your force is worth a certain amount of loot, and then, and that would be part of the army list. This unit of Spanish pikemen is worth X amount of loot, um, and that would go up and down depending on the quality of the unit, and then that would sort of determine the winner and loser in the basic scenario, and then that would also uh, allow you to easily do like campaigns. So if you gain X amount of loot from that engagement, you can only take as many more troops in the next game if you go up in size from um, that from the loot you gained from the previous game. So let's say you're the Habsburg side, you won against the Ottoman opponent, um, and then you get, let's just say, you win a really good victory, and you get 200 ducats of gold from your opponent. Um, but maybe the Ottoman side didn't take as many points or something, and they had slightly more loot than you, or leftover loot, going into the next game, so they could actually end up taking more, or you could have less. I don't know. Again, I'm just sort of throwing concepts out there. Um, but there would be other scenarios as well, of course, just to make it give people more options, and then you could always make up your own, um, and wouldn't have a fixed amount of turns. And this has been going a little long, so I'll start wrapping up here because I sort of laid everything out that I wanted to. Um, so uh, overall, I think my point with the game is making a uh, historically, approximate uh, skirmish game for this area, because it's not really war game that much. People don't really know a lot. It's kind of obscure, understandably, um, and uh, and have a game that's skirmish because that's how it really was. It really was a skirmish kind of warfare environment. They called it Little War in German. So um, that would be the thrust of the game. And again, trying to implement things, and the other goal I have with this is just to make it so there's always something you can do as a reaction potentially, and just to show that it's really quick, fluid kind of fighting. It's not big. This isn't pike and shot per se, where you have big formations moving and that sort of thing. This is quick, close in sort of engagements. Uh, and then just the last little bit would be I would have army lists for both sides, and so Ottoman obviously and Habsburg, and then I think depending on if I can get the sources for it, I would also include potentially Romanians and Transylvanians, because Transylvania was historically part of Hungary, and broke off into its own sort of independent kingdom. So Hungary in the 16th century was divided. You had the little strip basically that was Habsburg controlled. You have Ottoman Hungary, and then you have Transylvania. And Transylvania was kind of trying to play both sides. So if I can maybe work that in as a third force, or where both sides could take them as like support sort of troops potentially. Not sure yet. Again, a lot of this is going to have to come down to research, and just making decisions on the structure of the rules. So yeah, that's the. I'll wrap it up here. That's the video. Hope this wasn't too long. I try to keep the videos on the channel kind of concise. And if you guys have any suggestions, or have anything to add, I'd be happy to hear it. And thanks for watching. And I hope everybody has had a good Thanksgiving, and has a good Christmas coming up. Merry Christmas, everyone. And I will talk to you all next time.